All right. So this session is on color and contrast. This is an advanced topic. Some of the other basics, are important to have in place sometimes first before we jump into color and contrast. But color and contrast is really important as well. It just gets a little more complex and tends to require some additional tools. And so there becomes like another level of technical requirement that's sometimes necessary. If you recall from maybe other accessibility workshops that you've been involved with, using color carefully is one of our basic accessibility principles that we offer on our accessibility website. And that is really kind of the point of today's session and what I'll be focusing on. So before we dive into any details, it's important to consider, like, why do we use color in the first place? Like, what can color do? Why is color actually important that we would want to consider it? Right? Like, we could just do everything in grayscale and black and white and just avoid color altogether, right? Which typically can make like an accessible website, or accessible documents that can work. But why would we want to use color? Why isn't color important? Oh, I forgot to tell you, it's kind of interactive. Sorry.
Well, I depend on color for what I teach. And there are degrees of color when we're drafting that I'm trying to initiate, even though a lot of drafting is black and white, but it's not done on a type of paper necessarily. And now we're doing computer drafting that I have to be very careful with diagrams when I'm teaching my students, such as that, or thread selection or fabric, color.
So for those that aren't aware, Judy's in costume design, right?
Yeah. Well, and I'm in music, and even though much of that is oral, we talk about color all the time when it comes to different types of sound, and it gives us a much bigger palette of creativity than just simply black and white. That would be pretty boring. So that's my answer.
Thanks, Todd. I think these are two really important pieces to the puzzle. I pulled out some additional things to highlight that you might be thinking about. So we might be using color for branding purposes. So for example, if we're trying to reflect something that's part of SUNY Oswego, we might be using our brand colors for something, and then we need to be careful about how we're using them. We might be trying to use color for visual interest, right? Or to establish a theme, kind of like what Todd was saying, right? If it's all grayscale, it can get kind of boring. We might be using it to group related content. We might be trying to use it to convey meaning, maybe emotional or tonal kind of meaning, right? That it might take a lot of words to describe, right? So we might use color to provide a quick impression of something. So those are reasons why we typically use color, right? We're using color for engagement purposes. So we don't want to get rid of color, right? The way to do accessible color is not to get rid of it, right? Which I think is like what people initially do is like, whoa, hold the train, right? I'm gonna back that bus up and take a pause on this particular thing because it seems intimidating. So the goal here is not to get rid of color, but to use color in a more accessible way. So here are some basic guidelines, right, that we're going to go over in more detail today, but this is like the high level overview of the key things to keep in mind. There are some additional ones, but they tend to come up more so if you're like designing software or something, right? Like you're at a whole different level of creating digital content. So typically we want to make sure we're not using color alone to convey meaning, right? That we use some other ways in addition to color. We want to make sure that we're using text cues and labels and not relying just on symbols, especially when we're doing things like charts and graphs, right? We need to be careful about tonal contrast or the luminosity difference between like the foreground and the background. So typically, right, we could think about this as wanting light on dark or dark on light, right? And you can interpret that a little bit. There's a particular ratio that we would need to meet, and I'm going to show you some tools today that can help you figure that out, because you can't just like magically know. So that's typically a 4.5 to 1 contrast ratio between the foreground and background. And then one other important thing to keep in mind is to avoid red on black. And this is important accessibility guidance for people with some particular disabilities where kind of those longer wavelengths on black can be difficult to see. And so red on black is something in particular to stay away from. So I always like to center that the reason why we do digital accessibility is to support and provide access to people with disabilities, right? It's providing the human right that everyone has to getting the same information. So these guidelines in particular that we're gonna kind of focus on today specifically support folks with partial or low vision, maybe color deficiencies and aging eyes, right? You may not know this, but as your eyes get older, the ability to distinguish between colors and things actually begins to decrease. The benefits, some added benefits to making using accessible colors is that it can help in low light situations, especially if it's like on print, right? It can help with screen glare, and it can also help if you're using a monochrome screen display. So who do these guidelines that we're going to talk about leave out? Right? There are some disabilities and things that are not fully accommodated in our accessibility guidelines. We typically follow the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which are put out by an organization called the W3C. They are internationally recognized standards, and they're continually revising these standards. The current standard is WCAG 2.2, which is not necessarily the legal standard, but definitely the one we want to be using. We always want to be using the newest version because they're rewritten continuously to include more people, right? And so this newer version, the WCAG 2.2 that was released somewhat recently, starts to address some additional disabilities like learning disabilities, cognitive disabilities, and things that just weren't super included before, right? And they were acknowledged in previous versions of these standards that they were not fully addressed. So I'm going to put that in the chat. If you open up the WCAG standards, they're a bit intimidating if you're not familiar. So, you know, they're technical specifications, right? So when we get into them, they look a little intimidating. Like this is what they look like, right? So I'm going to give you the high level overview today. But, you know, I encourage you that if you do a lot of work, especially digitally, you might want to start perusing these specifications because they're important. So the people who are kind of left out with these particular guidelines are some people who may have visual or cognitive disabilities or combinations of disabilities that really require them to be able to control the size, color combination, and level of distraction of what they're viewing. And so there are a lot of kind of add-ons to browsers or other assistive technology that can be installed in the computer that kind of help strip things away and give you control. And there's ways that you may need to code something to provide some of this functionality to be available to end users that really go beyond the scope of what I'm going to cover today. There is a AAA level. So for those of you familiar with WCAG standards, they come in 3 tiers. The single A level, which are like the absolute minimum to provide any accessible access. The AA standard, which is kind of typically what is more like the legal standard. And then the AAA, which is like your super awesome standard. And the guidelines around this, these particular disabilities and some of this functionality is at that AAA standard, which is beyond the scope of what this particular presentation is about. I'm not going to read through each of these, but I do want to just point out that the guidelines and the guidance that I'm going to provide today do map to very specific WCAG guidelines. Okay. And so I'm sharing this just as like an FYI so that you know that this is grounded in something real and I got it from a real place and I'm not just making this up, right? But I'm going to try to translate it into English. So the first standard is 1.3.3 sensory characteristics. And this standard really talks about not relying on just color to communicate information. It also expands that to include not relying on any sensory characteristic to communicate without having something else available, right? So not just shape or location or size or color or sound. Another guideline that we're going to kind of talk about is 1.4.1, the use of color. And this is very specific to color, and it complements the one that we were just looking at, which basically says you can't use color alone to communicate something. So you can't rely on some color-coded system to be the only way to communicate information. And we'll go through some examples of that in a minute. We're also going to talk about 1.4.3 contrast, and this is really talking about that kind of difference in tonal contrast between the foreground and the background that we talked about earlier. There's also contrast in relationship to content that's not text. 2.4.11 is focus appearance, and this would apply to people who might be making more interactive systems. And this implies that if someone's using a keyboard, something comes into keyboard focus, it needs to also meet these standards. So really anything that's interactive, anything that's got text and conveying meaning, any of those items need to meet these contrast standards. And the standards are all basically the same. So once you learn the basic rule, you can apply it to these different contexts. So the first tip, right, that we've talked about and I want to demonstrate to you is not using color alone to convey meaning. So here are some examples of ways that in our everyday lives we might see ways that color is not the only way that meaning is conveyed. So a stop sign has a shape, it's an octagon, right? It's red, so that is an important color indicator, but it's not the only indicator. And it also has the word stop on it, right? So we've got shape, color, and the word, all providing some meaning and information here. A traffic light has components of 3 lights, red on top, yellow in the middle, and green on the bottom. And those have position, right? And then kind of an on-off state, right? Like the light is on or the light is off, to communicate information in addition to color. You might know that like on Tip Hill, right? The sign is upside, the traffic light is upside down, and it needs to have a label on it telling people that it's upside down, because this can be a real problem. One of the most common types of color blindness is red-green color blindness, which means that like you can't really differentiate between the two. And so that could be a real problem if you switch the order when they have opposite meaning. Another example here is a yield sign. Again, it's got a shape, it's got a color, right? So it's triangular, it's got a red triangle that's got a smaller white triangle on top. And then on top of that, there is red text. The red text reads yield. So it's got a text label as well. This can be a real problem when we start thinking about charts and graphs. So the example up on the screen is coming from a Google spreadsheet, and it's like scores for teams, right? Just a really simple example. And the colors here are really not meeting our accessible standards. There's not high contrast, but more importantly, and what we're talking about right now is that right now they're relying on color alone to convey information. We'll get to the contrast piece in a second. So I want to flip over to this example, and I do have, if you'd like to make your own copy to play around with, I'm going to put the link in the chat. And so in here, you can see that, one of the defaults that comes up is that you have a legend, and the legend just has the color with a label. But this assumes that you can distinguish the colors. right? So this can be a problem using a method like this. So one of the things that you can do, whether or not you're using, Google spreadsheets, or you're using, PowerPoint, you're using Excel, whatever you're using, there's generally options to customize these things. And so what you're looking for is something that's more like a labeled version, right? Where it's going to point to the specific slice, and then it's going to provide that specific information, so that you're not just getting kind of the color representation, but you're getting these really clear labels. So you do want to make sure that you're turning those on, right? So I'm going to leave this example at this spot for this moment, in part because we're going to talk about color contrast ratios in a minute, and then we'll come back to this example to kind of further clean it up. But this is step one of making it better. Okay. Any questions on that? Again, I want to remind anyone, if you have questions or if you want to chime in or follow up on something, you're welcome to just unmute and chime in, or put something in the chat. So again, you want to make sure that you're not relying on color to communicate. So here, this example we looked at initially, color is the only way to kind of figure out what slice has what label, and switching our design to being more like this, that has the labels pointing to them, is a good solution to providing a text alternative here. Our next main tip is to meet these contrast ratios that we were talking about. And so color has, some different properties that we want to be looking at. There's hue, which is when we talk about color, most people are talking about hue. So red, orange, yellow, right? But what we really need to talk about is kind of like how light and bright and how muted and dark those colors are when they overlap with one another. And that's what really leads to this idea of contrast. And so these examples over here on the right, this orange on top, this black on top of orange, this green on top of black, and this kind of dark plum color on top of a very weird, ugly pink, all have the same relative contrast ratio. They all have a contrast ratio of 8.4 to 1, which far exceeds even the AAA standard of accessibility. One example I like to share is there was a big hubbub about a football game now a number of years ago, where they were wearing these all single color jerseys, and the Jets were playing the Buffalo Bills, and the Jets were in all green and the Buffalo Bills were in all red, and they're of the same tone. So if you can't differentiate red from green, right, you have that color deficiency, then you see this, which is really hard to follow as people are moving around and you can't necessarily see like icons on helmets and things. So there was a lot of controversy about like this choice and not having this contrast between the jerseys, because it wasn't able to be seen, especially because these players are moving around and interacting with one another. So the tool I'm going to recommend for everyone is one that you actually install on your computer. And there are other tools that you don't have to install, but I like this one the best because it allows you to check the color contrast of anything in any software. So you could be working in an Adobe Creative Suite piece of software. You could be working in Microsoft Office. You could be in a browser. You could be browsing photos in your photo library on your computer. You could be anywhere, and this piece of software will work for you to be able to determine the color contrast and whether or not something meets that contrast. So if you click on that link, you end up, oops, need to do that. You end up on a web page that looks like this. And if you have a Windows machine, you would click the one that says for Windows. And if you have a Mac, you would click the one that says for Mac, and it will download and walk you through how to install it. I have it installed on my computer, and I'm going to try to demonstrate how this works. And I do need to share my full screen to be able to do that. And I just accidentally opened up like 7,000 things on accident. So hold on.
Rebecca, as
Yeah.
you're clicking on things, I'm really glad to see this link because this morning I went to the new program interaction workshop on what's replacing our wonderful Blackboard.
Bright space,
And
yes.
yeah, please, I'm so happy to get rid of Blackboard to anything else. But I asked the question about accessibility, and they were like, well, a lot of it's built in, but we don't know, which is true. Everyone's learning this. But to see this link, I know that in the D to L, I think it's called,
Yep.
that we will be able to use something like this that will cross over to platforms. So thank you. I really appreciate it. So for those who don't know, you're going to love this.
Yeah, I really love this tool. I used to use other ones, and I've really settled in on this one. So this is, we're gonna, welcome to my computer. Can you see the whole thing? All right, good. I cleaned everything up, I think. So on here, you can see the color contrast analyzer open, and then this is the presentation we've been looking at. So we can check the colors in my presentation to see if they meet color contrast standards. So I'm gonna first use this eyedropper icon. So I clicked on it for the foreground color. The foreground color, when we're dealing with text, is gonna be the text. Okay, so we're gonna come over here, and I can just put my cursor essentially over the text here, click on it, and it's going to grab that color. That color is in a hexadecimal code. It doesn't really matter if you know what a hexadecimal code is, just know that it's like a digital representation of the color, but essentially hex means 6, right? So it's a 6-digit code. The first two values are related to the red value, green and blue, and red, green, and blue are essentially the primary colors of light, which is what you experience on your screen. And then the background color is going to be whatever is behind the text. Oops. And we can grab that one as well by using the eyedropper under the background color section here and come over and grab that. And you'll see, right, that this is the foreground color, this is the background color, and then down below, it's going to show you the results, right? And whether or not it meets the contrast standards. And it's testing against our WCAG 2.1 standards, which are the same in terms of contrast, are the same as the newest version of WCAG 2.2. So you can get some more information by toggling these down of what these minimums are, and what regular text versus large text is. But essentially it gives you a pass, right, or a fail, right? So if this brown was a different color, oops, I meant to change its lightness. So let's say it's a lighter color, maybe it's more of an orange, right? You can see those icons and the words changing down at the bottom. So this orange on top of this cream color would not meet these contrast standards. They get these like fails. Does that make sense to everybody? So it's a pretty easy tool to use. You just launch the tool, right? And you can click around on anything that's here. Another example would be we can quickly check the interface that's up here. We can check this white. Oops, I just clicked out of it. Sorry. I can check the white and the red that is part of the interface of Zoom to see whether or not that meets accessibility standards, right? And you can see that it meets the AA standard, but not the AAA standard, right? And somehow it's bound to happen. I broke Zoom. Hold on. I can't get it back. All right, there we go. So sorry, I just accidentally totally just clicked off of it. All right, so what I was trying to show you and realized that I stopped showing you is that this is the stop share button that's in Zoom. And so this is the background color of the button. This is the foreground color. So it meets our AA standards, but not the AAA standards. So you can go around like investigating every little thing you interact with now, because now you have the tools to do that. So here's another example. And this one, you know, is just all baked into this presentation. So here's an example advertisement. And I want us to focus in on the text down here at the bottom. The text is using this hexadecimal code A66A70, and the background is this like light gray, which is a hex code of EDEBF2. And if we use our contrast analyzer, which I did in this example here, and just put a screenshot up here for you to see, you can see down in this tool that it is failing some tests and passing some others, right? So it is showing you that the contrast ratio is 3.3 to 1. And what this means is that it's going to pass for large text. Typically, this would be headings. And this typically means something that's about like 1.5 times the size of your regular font size. So something that's much larger. Versus your normal text that has a much higher ratio that requires a 4.5 to 1 ratio. So that does not work for the body text, but would be fine for like a headline on something, right? And so if we go back to this example again, it's basically saying that this bigger text is okay, but the smaller text is not. Does that make sense to everybody? Usually if it's like a big paragraph of text or something, you want to really lean towards something that's fairly dark on light or very light on dark, right? And not something that's more of a medium tone, which this kind of mauve color is. My next tip for kind of digital accessibility in terms of getting digital accessible text content, right? Is to use somewhat of a limited color palette. As indicated on this slide, too much variation of color is a problem, right? Perhaps you find it distracting and you can't decide what's important to look at or where the focus should be. And it might even change the meaning if we can't kind of find a place for our eye to settle and understand what's supposed to be important here. Everything here is shouting for attention, right? And just really conflicts with what's going on. So you want to really simplify what you're doing and focus on fewer colors and a more limited palette when we have a lot of text to look at. So my tips are things like, you know, limit to 2 to 3 colors, a light, a dark, and maybe a medium. You want to use color consistently for the same type of information. So if you've chosen to use green for headlines, then you want to do that consistently within a document. You want to minimize distractions when possible, especially if it's for long form reading, right? If you have lots of paragraphs, like in a syllabus or something, right? Like you want to make sure that there's not a lot going on around it so someone can actually focus on the text that's there. And you can definitely use the color to set a tone or mood, but you may want to make sure that that is complemented by also setting the tone and mood with maybe the way that it's written, right? In the voice that it's written in, as another way of establishing that same bit of information. So now that we have a little more information about those other tips, we can circle back to that example we were working on before. And we can start to realize perhaps that the contrast here is not enough, right? These light gray boxes are not going to be sufficiently dark, right? So we would want to update those to be a darker color. So you can kind of come in and customize individual components that are here. And you can also come in and customize individual pieces of a chart or graph in Excel or in Google Sheets. And you can come in and put in a specific color. So how do you know what to put in, right? Well, you can choose a color that's here and then use the color contrast checker that we were talking about. Or you could start with the color contrast checker, find a couple of colors you like together that meet the standards, and then copy those hex codes over. So if you recall when we were looking at, I can just do the screenshot. You can just grab these little hex codes. So for example, this one's ECEAF1. I could literally just copy that and paste it in over here if I'm making a custom color. So I can bring in the colors and things that I want to be able to use. Does that make sense? So that you can verify, that something is dark enough. So then you're going to want to make sure that the colors that are adjacent to that puzzle, that pie piece, have enough contrast between one another and between it and the background. Another strategy you can use is starting to pull out these pieces, right? And if you start to pull out the pieces, you want to make sure you still have the labels on them. But if you start to pull them out, then there starts being white space, right? That provides that same contrast around it so that it becomes distinguishable. So you could use both or either of those, as an option. Does that make sense, everybody? And what you'll quickly realize is that the defaults in Excel and in Google Slides and in Google Sheets are often not that accessible. And so you really do need kind of to go in and to customize them frequently. And so if it's something that you do regularly, you may want to establish a couple of color palettes that you use frequently for, let's say, like classroom presentations and things, and just have those codes readily available when you're working on something like this so that you can figure that out. Does that make sense? So there are places to customize, but there are limitations. You'll notice that as soon as I pulled it away from the center, now we have this labeling problem, right? And built into this particular tool, I have no ability to label inside the slice or with the extended like pointer labels anymore, right? And so that then becomes a problem, right? And I might manually have to put labels or things on, which can be an issue. So again, the default's not always the best solution to these things. You really need to be aware of thinking about how all the things are related next to each other. So I wanted to make sure that we had ample time for questions and things. So are there ways that you're trying to use color in different software that you're curious about, a workflow or anything else related to color that you'd like some feedback on or some strategies for?
Well, I just, I was looking at I used a PowerPoint template for my presentation tomorrow, Rebecca, and I was just curious. I thought, I don't know that that's enough contrast, even though I ran the accessibility checker in PowerPoint and it said, oh, it's fine. And I just downloaded the little contraption, the little add-on that you just had, the checker, and I used it, and it says no, it's not.
Yeah,
I can definitely confirm what you just said, is that these default templates in some of the programs, they aren't infallible.
Yeah, and you bring up a good point, Todd. So I would like to just point out that you could start with a template and customize it. So it will work really similar in PowerPoint to how it works in Google Slides, but essentially there is an ability to go in and edit what's called like the master slides. So in PowerPoint, I think it's called master slides. In Google Slides, it's called the theme builder. But if you go in, these are all of the kind of default layouts that come with the theme. I recommend keeping the boxes that are here, and you can rearrange them however you want. But they are specifically set up so like this one's a heading and this is text. And so you want to keep the heading one a heading and this one the text, but you can rearrange and change what it looks like. But you could make sure, for example, for presentations, I recommend making sure that your body type is at least 24 pixels, right? So you would want to make sure that it says at least 24. And so you could highlight all of them and make sure it's 24 and it fixes all your slides all at once. And you can also adapt your color palette in the same way. So I really love this because this is something that we don't always know about. But let's say I want to change my background color. There's ones that come with your actual template, right? And that's usually the ones that are up on the top. And if you click the little edit button, you can see the theme colors, right, that are here. And you can also like come right in here and like edit them. Of course, you would need to have your handy dandy color contrast analyzer right by you while you're doing this. But this is a quick way to update everything all at once. So Todd, not all is lost, right? You can take a quick look at what you have, see if you can tweak the color a little bit and just update the template, and it will update all of your slides accordingly.
Great. Yeah, no, I was playing with a color in the same sort of general vicinity, but a darker hue of it. Yep. And that passed for all but one of them. So
awesome.
So great. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for sharing that example, Todd. Judy, what time is Judy was asking what time, Todd, is your workshop tomorrow?
I believe I'm at the first one. It was at 10 o'clock, I believe.
There's one at 9 and there's one at 10. So.
Oh gosh, I better look.
Well, you know what? I might have.
It's right.
We have the answer here. We just need to get to it here.
I was going to say, what's its title? Because I'm signed up for something, but I don't know if
those that you wanted to address.
This is just, hi, Rebecca. This is just really helpful for me because I was diagnosed with glaucoma when I was only like 26 years old. So contrast is really important for me.
Yeah, definitely. And many of us, right? Like many of us need the contrast. One other thing that I didn't address here is that sometimes the like absolute like highest contrast, right? Like the white on black or black on white can be a little problematic for people. For me personally, it makes like things on the screen dance a little bit. So often you'll see when I give presentations that I usually use like an off white and an off black of some sort. So it might be a dark gray or like a brown or something.
Yes, I have the same thing, the dancing a little bit there too. Yes.
Yeah, so always something good to kind of keep in the back of your mind too, that is not spelled out by WCAG, but definitely something from my design experience can be a problem.
I have a child with a very rare dyslexia, and I think I've talked to you about this, Rebecca. I learned color contrast real fast. It's a definite blind spot. So when we realized he wasn't seeing right, he has to read white print on black background or a lighter. And because he works in a technical field and such, his employers have been wonderfully accommodating. They have been doing training manuals, and he has a lot of stuff he can do on computer by just switching his contrast. But it took a lot of years of people saying, no, that isn't a thing, which it is.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for sharing that example, Judy. And that does bring up something else that I didn't cover, like just because I knew we wouldn't have time to get into it. But more and more devices, digital devices like computers, phones, etc., have a dark mode capability now, which inverts the colors, but it doesn't always invert them in the way that you expect, right? So it may be worth checking things, especially maybe important materials that you're sharing with students, checking it in dark mode on your computer if you have it available to you, just to see what happens, just to make sure that like contrast is still maintained in the way that you would expect. And the way that that works typically, it works well if the documents and things are set up well, right? Which is a little beyond the scope of today. But you know, it's a quick thing to check if you just turn on dark mode on your computer. And typically, not always, that's available on your phone or on your computer in like the accessibility panel of your kind of system preferences. Anything else? All right. Well, I appreciate your time today. We can stop the recording. I can hang out too if people have some questions they don't